Thanks for having me. The title of my talk is Dusting's Disappearing Act. And when you read Seminar VII, I think perhaps the most shocking thing about it is the disappearing act that Dusting performs. So when one begins a seminar, one has the sense, given its prominence, that the concept will provide the key to interpreting the ethics of psychoanalysis. That's the title of the seminar. And then Dusting becomes this central character, if you will. But if it is the key, Lacan might say hides the lock. After spending the majority of the seminar introducing and exploring the concept of dusting, Lacan basically stops referring to it once he begins to talk about Antigone. That's in the final 3 sessions. This is the play that will ultimately exemplify his ethics. What's more, when it comes to providing a pithy statement of his ethical position, this is the statement, the only thing one can be guilty of is giving ground relative to one's desire, it makes no reference at all to dusting. So Lacan sets up his discussion of the ethics of psychoanalysis by identifying the centrality of dusting in the subject and in the subject's relationship with others. But then he seems to leave it behind when it comes to theorizing the ethical position, which seems very strange to me. And so that's the impetus behind what I want to talk to you about. But this disappearance, I think, actually places an ethical imperative upon us as readers of the text. In order to make sense of what the ethical position inherent in psychoanalysis might be, I think we have to trace the role that dusting plays in its absence, or we have to locate dusting in the constitution of ethics where Lacan doesn't make it clear. So when examining the fate that dusting undergoes in the course of Seminar VII, one might say that Lacan is kind of enacting in the form of the seminar what he's discussing in the content. So dusting itself is an absence, this void existing inside. The example he uses the vase that he gets from Heidegger. After establishing dusting as this fundamental absence that structures our subjectivity, he forces those listening to him in the seminar to confront the absence at the precise point where they would expect the answer. In this sense, I think the absence of dusting in the discussion of Antigone represents a way of revealing it, revealing it through its absence. One detects dusting through its effects on other objects. There's no way to confront it directly. There's no way to have this direct experience of dusting. Instead, we have to piece together its role from the implications that Lacan leaves behind. So he gives us a sense of it, but he doesn't take it all the way and show it as an active force in the construction of what he considers the ethics of psychoanalysis. This obtrusive disappearance, if we can call it that, of dusting in the ethics seminar, I think paves the way for its vanishing in Lacan's thought after this seminar. So if you read Seminar VII thinking, oh, this is a kind of a cool concept, I want to see what he does with it later, you're going to be wildly disappointed, I think. He mentions it only a handful of times in subsequent seminars. One of the maybe most prominent mentions is Seminar XVI, from another to the other, as this focus on dusting gives way to an emphasis on the objet. So if you come to Lacan looking for dusting, you're going to end up finding the objet. One might say it that way. Whereas dusting is the void that opens beyond a signifier, outside of signification, the objet is the curvature of symbolic spaces. So it's the distortion that desire produces within the signifier. So there's this sense that dusting is beyond, objet is distortion within. Something like that. There's thus a certain danger involved in speaking about dusting, I think, a risk of implying that when referring to it, one is attempting to step outside of language while continuing all along to speak. And I think it's possible to postulate that this is why Lacan himself turns away from it, both in this seminar and in his later thinking. So Lacan runs the risk in Seminar VII of talking about what is outside of speech, and then backs away from it in years afterward, although he never returns to the question of ethics to reformulate his ethical position in light of this turn from dusting to objet. So there's not an ethical exploration that makes objet central in the way dusting is central to his ethical exploration in Seminar VII. We could say that ethics disappears along with the thing. That's what happens in Lacan's thinking. So this seminar thus I want to say, represents Lacan at his boldest. So the point at which he hazards a line of thinking that has an explicit ethico-political, maybe, claim to it. And I don't think it's an accident that many of the thinkers that want to push Lacan as a political thinker come back to Seminar VII and come back to the figure of Antigone. Most recently, Alenka Zupancic wrote a book called Let Them Rot, which is just a book about Antigone, and it takes up more or less Lacan's reading, but then pushes it in another direction. But suffices to say that to think of him as a political or ethical thinker, this is the crucial point. But at the same time, I also want to say it marks one of the most significant missteps of his intellectual career. And I think the misstep lies in associating the thing and the enjoyment of it with transgression. And I think this is a big problem in the seminar that I'll try to also touch on as I talk about the trajectory of Das Ding. So while recognizing the ethical potential of the psychoanalytic project, Lacan also manages to confine this ethical position to the perpetual defiance of the law, which resembles, I think, perversion a little bit too much to be a convincing form of ethics. And I think the mentions of exploration of sod in this seminar is also somewhat of a problem. In the pages that follow, I'm going to attempt to separate, if I can be so bold, the wheat from the chaff, to interpret the role that Das Ding plays in the ethics of psychoanalysis while distancing this ethical position from Lacan's insistence on transgression and the association of transgression with enjoyment in this seminar. So the central invocation of Seminar VII, and one could even say all of Lacan's life, concerns sublimation. That's the great discovery in the seminar, I think. So Lacan defines sublimation in a way that runs counter to Freud's own conception, even though he's not foregrounding that. He's saying, oh, this is kind of what Freud thinks, but this is not really what Freud thinks. So for Freud, of course, sublimation, which he contrasts with repression, involves the full satisfaction of the drive, but it's the satisfaction that occurs through a socially acceptable object. Freud talks about the way work works as a fulfillment of sexual drive, etc. It creates a detour of the drive that produces, for Freud, satisfaction in a non-sexual, and not initially non-sexual object. So for Freud, sublimation enables me to experience sexual satisfaction while fighting fires or selling light bulbs, even, maybe. I was trying to think of the most boring job I could, and that seemed boring to me. As he does with castration, Lacan broadens Freud's concept. So he theorizes sublimation in Seminar VII in a way that makes it cease to be a special way that we satisfy the drive and becomes the way that the drive satisfies itself. So for Lacan, there's no satisfaction of the drive without sublimation because it's sublimation that creates an object for us to enjoy. So such objects don't just exist, but must emerge through the sublimating act. I think this is to me, the great part of this seminar, that there aren't just objects that are desirable. There is the act of sublimation that gives us objects to desire. So one could say it this way, there are no natural objects of desire, not even sexual organs, nothing satisfying for the subject's drives in itself. Instead, sublimation produces such objects. Lacan's explanation of the process of sublimation has become actually one of his most famous statements. So I read the formula of desire, I mentioned the formula of desire earlier. This is maybe even equally famous formulation from this seminar. He proclaims that sublimation raises an object to the dignity of the thing, right? So lifting an ordinary object out of circulation, I think it's important, it's out of the circulation of use, and treating it as an end in itself, provides an orientation for one's drive. And this is the key to sublimation. So it arrests a generalized exchangeability of objects by subtracting an object from the field of exchangeable objects in order to establish it as the foundation for the subject's enjoyment. That's as I see it, that's how he understands what sublimation does and why it's this act of subtract. So it's not an act of, it elevates an object to the dignity of the thing, but it also subtracts an object from the exchange of all the objects that are being exchanged and used. This enjoyment for Lacan has no end outside of itself, which means that the value of the object lies in itself, not in its exchange value or its use value. This is an interesting way that he's working against, at least along the spirit of Marx and against the idea of capitalist reproduction or capitalist production. So sublimation is an ethical struggle against exchange value. Although sublimation is necessarily unconscious, we don't consciously determine what's going to function as our thing, I don't think. It defines the singularity of the subject by giving the subject a relation to a point that transcends the realm of all ordinary objects, all empirical objects. Dusting, we could say, provides the subject with an orientation for its existence, an orientation that actually enables it to establish a transcendent value in the form of this sublimated object that becomes the thing. Whereas Freud views sublimation as one of the vicissitudes of the drive, Lacan rightly, I think, sees sublimation as the drive's sine qua non. It's through sublimation that the drive acquires an object worthy of its pursuit. And this is what leads Joan Kopchak to claim, I love this idea, sublimation is not something that happens to the drive under special circumstances, it is the proper destiny of the drive. Right? So no drive without sublimation, not sublimation as the deviation of the drive. Without sublimation, the drive simply couldn't function. And Lacan's reformulation of the concept of sublimation, I think, marks his most radical transformation of Freud's theory. And it's a transformation that enables him to denaturalize the drive beyond what Freud himself thought possible. It also enables him to construct an ethics of psychoanalysis. And I think that it will play a huge part in his reading of Antigone. Sublimation is at work throughout the spectator's relationship to the play Antigone. So Antigone herself becomes a sublime object through Sophocles' depiction of her, which is what gives her this splendor that Lacan finds. So he uses this word a couple times to talk about her. Splendor, la splendeur d'Antigone. At the same time, Antigone as a character in the play enacts the process of sublimation relative to her brother. So she's both herself a sublime object for us, and she does the act of sublimating. She insists on burying Polynices because he has for her the status of dusting. She experiences an ethical duty toward him that trumps all other incentives. So she's the example of the ethics of desire because she elevates an object to the dignity of dusting and then never wavers in her commitment to it. Her act of sublimation is what gives her this sublime aura for those looking at the play, watching it, or even reading it. Even though Lacan doesn't mention sublimation in his discussion of Antigone, which I find very strange, or in his formulation of the ethics of psychoanalysis in the final session of the seminar, sublimation, I think, is clearly evident in what Antigone does and in how we respond to her. Given the language that he uses to describe her, Lacan himself undoubtedly considers Antigone a sublime figure, an instance of the beautiful that puts us on the track of the real of our desire. She's a sublime figure because of her own act of sublimation. So she attains a sublime value for us as spectators precisely through her insistence that Polynices has a sublime value for her. What stands out in Lacan's analysis of Antigone is the position that she comes to occupy in the play. So her insistence on burying Polynices, regardless of the consequences, places her beyond the limits that govern the realm of the good, a realm that Lacan himself calls the service of goods. This reveals to us, I think, that what inheres in every act of sublimation. So sublimation and the drive that accompanies it place one beyond the pleasure principle and beyond the service of goods, which is the capitalist socioeconomic system. So even though Antigone predates that system by approximately, 2,000 years, Lacan finds himself drawn to the play and to Antigone because her sublimation places her at odds with the capitalist system, a system that functions by reducing every object to its exchange value. That's what capitalism does. The ethics of psychoanalysis that Lacan identifies is an ethics that tries to navigate a path, I think, beyond capitalist relations of production. So Lacan opposes the ethics of psychoanalysis to the service of goods. When he does this, his target, I want to argue, is the capitalist realm, the realm of capitalist exchange. So by reducing all objects to their exchange value and to logic of the commodity, capitalism completely obfuscates our relationship to the sublime. We cease to recognize how we enjoy, since our enjoyment necessarily depends, I think, on what defies exchange, what can't be exchanged. Of course, capitalism doesn't do without sublimation. It uses sublimation to create value and then obscures it behind the facade of the commodity. By creating a universe in which we rely on the sublime without ever becoming aware of our encounter with it, the capitalism attempts to generate right-wing populist reactions that promise a restoration of the sublime. This is why Donald Trump, I think for one, gloms onto fighting for the statues of great figures of the past, or why Adolf Hitler, for another, inveighs against the leveling effects of Judeo-Bolshevism. In both cases, these leaders are responding to the absence of any ostensible sublime with promises of the reintroduction of it into society. They are what we get when we allow the capitalist leveling process to continue without challenging it with the force of sublimation. So capitalism's relationship to Das Ding is conflicted. On the one hand, it ruthlessly reduces every object to the commodity and thereby squelches Das Ding. Seems clear. It demands submission of all objects to the field of exchange value, in which nothing is allowed to stand out. So capitalism permits no object to remain singular. But, on the other hand, value within the capitalist system depends on the erection of Das Ding. Without the sublimation that creates Das Ding, no one would ever buy any commodity. So desire for the commodity, any commodity, stems from the residue of sublimation that remains in it. So we could say that capitalism relies on sublimation and also relies on its disavowal. The disavowal of Das Ding hides the source of the commodity's value. The price of the commodity is not equivalent to its value. This is a very important point for Marx. It is instead the necessary obstacle that prevents one from having an unlimited quantity of the commodity. But the commodity itself contains Das Ding, which confers value on the object. Its value stems from the collective sublimation that occurs within it. This sublimation raises an everyday object to the dignity of the thing, and thereby makes it desirable on the market. And I think Lacan's project in Seminar VII is an attack on commodity fetishism and its deleterious effects on our subjectivity. By placing emphasis on the thing, he poses sublimation as a critical response to the capitalist system. Although capitalism requires sublimation in order to reproduce itself, it demands that we incessantly retreat from the sublimated thing to the exchangeable commodity. But by sustaining the path of sublimation and continuing to recognize Das Ding instead of the commodity, or at the heart of the commodity, we chart a path out of capitalist relations of production, which depend on an unrelenting fetishism. Das Ding, as the void that undermines all presence, is the anti-fetish, I want to say. It's the absence that fetishism always attempts to obscure. Antigone, for her part, refuses to accede to Creon's order that no one bury Polynices because she elevates her brother to the status of Das Ding. Her act of sublimation forms the connection between Lacan's elaboration of Das Ding and his analysis of the play. And I think it's the reason why Lacan chooses the play to exemplify his ethics. Antigone defends herself against Creon by invoking the singularity of her brother, a singularity that she contrasts with a potential husband or her child. She says, I could have replaced my husband, I could replace a child, but I couldn't replace my brother. And this passage is very scandalous, right? Everyone, including Goethe, was very scandalized by that. And Lacan says, in the end, precisely because it carries with it the suggestion of a scandal, this passage is of interest to us. So this passage that Goethe finds scandalous, some translators actually leave out of Antigone because they think it's terrible. The idea that she would do this for her brother, but not for her husband. She could get another, not for her child. She could always get another, but the singularity of the brother. Lacan finds this really important. And I think it's important for him that she doesn't defend herself by appealing to the authority of the gods or any other kind of authority. Her only attempt at a justification for her act refers to who Polynices is. From the beginning of Creon's interrogation to the end of the play, she appeals only to the singularity of her brother. Lacan summarizes her position in this way. My brother is what he is, and it's because he is what he is and only can be what he is that I move forward to the fatal limit. If it were anyone else with whom I might enter into a human relationship, my husband or my children, for example, they are replaceable. The bizarreness of this claim, I think, is integral to its appeal. Lacan hones in on Antigone's specific defense of her action because it sounds so strange to our ears. And what sounds strange are exactly the words of sublimation. So we hear Antigone claim that she values her brother over a potential son because she could always have another son. That seems to violate our sense of how anyone would value things. What she says, it does violence to our common sense. It does so because she's talking about her own act of sublimation. And sublimation always cuts against common sense by creating a value that matters for the subject and for no one else. Right? That's the key to sublimation. Like, I elevate it, no one else necessarily does. Polynices has this extreme value for Antigone insofar as he functions as her thing. And the burial of Polynices marks his status of das Ding. So burial takes the body out of circulation, and it affirms that the body is not just another object, but that it contains das Ding. Creon doesn't just treat Polynices as an enemy of the country, one buries the enemy, but instead attempts to strip him of subjectivity, to treat him as he's just another object that you can leave lying on the ground. As unburied, it's as if he has no thing. The thing is an absolute singularity. It's a dark spot within the subject, the point at which the subject doesn't even know itself. Das Ding enthralls others because no one, not even me, can make sense of it, right? So we can't will the thing into existence. Sublimation doesn't work automatically when I express my devotion to something or to someone. I have to pay the price for it with an act of conspicuous sacrifice. So sacrifice attests to the value of the thing, but more than that, it constitutes the object as a thing by giving it the value of what I've given up. So there's no shortcut, I don't think, to the creation of das Ding, nor a shortcut to enjoyment. It always has to pass through the subject sacrifice because sacrifice elevates an object out of the realm of all other objects. So that's why sacrifice is important, because it has this elevating effect. So it lets us know that we can find the subjectivity of the subject in this object. That's what happens when we sacrifice for it. To find the essence of the subject, we need to only look for the evidence of its senseless sacrifices. Antigone doesn't have a monopoly on these. She does have a good one. Everyone partakes in senseless sacrifice insofar as everyone enjoys. I now want to talk a little bit about the relationship between das Ding and objet, because I think this is really important to clarify the role that sublimation plays. So das Ding and objet are a little bit like Clark Kent and Superman. When you look through Lacan's works, we almost never see them together, which prompts some people who are suspicious, like Lois Lane, to wonder if they're not just two names for the same thing. A friend of mine who loves Lacan said, wait a minute, these are just the same. He just changed his mind. But no, there's a little difference. So perhaps Lacan begins, this is the idea, theorizing the object that causes our desire as the abyssal das Ding, and later comes to see it as a fissure in the perceptual field, which he names the objet. Unlike das Ding, objet doesn't seem so radically foreign to the signifying order. Instead, it indicates a revelatory disturbance rather than a gaping void, one could say. But the key to understanding the importance of das Ding is mapping its relationship to objet, this concept that threatens to replace it. In his early seminars, Lacan mentions something that he calls the objet, but prior to Seminar VII, it is always just an imaginary object. So when he's saying objet in the first 6 seminars, he doesn't mean objet in the sense that he will mean it starting in Seminar IX on identification. That is, the objet of the early seminars has nothing at all to do with the objet understood as the object cause of desire. So this first theorization of objet as the real object cause of desire comes in Seminar IX. As I said, this is the identification seminar. And toward the end of the seminar, he says, it is at the point where all signification is lacking, is abolished at the nodal point of the desire of the other, at the phallic point, insofar as it signifies the abolition of all significance, that the objet comes to take its place. So Lacan theorizes the objet as what's missing in the field of signification and what disturbs that field. This absence functions as a barrier to what we desire, and that's why it serves as an object cause of desire, as this barrier to what we desire. Both das Ding and objet are absences. Yes, that's the similarity. Objet is the barrier that the subject confronts, however. This barrier triggers the subject's desire by obscuring das Ding, the point of transcendence that introduces value into the subject's existence. So we never have any direct contact with the transcendence of das Ding thanks to the barrier that objet puts up against it. So the thing lies beyond the realm of signification, but the beyond is nothing but a void, a nothingness that the subject can't have. But the objet enables the subject to relate to this void. This is the crucial role that it plays. It establishes the path through which the subject can remain faithful to its thing. The turn from das Ding to objet in Lacan's thought represents a gradual turning away from the granting of the Oedipus complex a central position in the psyche, I think. I think it's pretty clear that as objet becomes more prominent, Oedipal complex becomes less important. So as objet becomes the featured object, Lacan mentions Oedipal complex much less frequently. Every iteration of das Ding, in contrast, recalls the original mother thing. In fact, he'll even use that term, and people often will talk about das Ding in terms of mother thing. The objet has no specific relationship to the mother, however. It's rather this little piece of the subject itself that has broken off and, in a way, kick-started the subject's desire. Although Lacan doesn't articulate it himself, because he has yet to develop his concept of objet, one of his examples of das Ding in Seminar VII actually has the merit of illustrating both objet and das Ding. The first example Lacan chooses to illustrate it is the idea of the vase. So the vase is interesting, right? So the material of the vase would be the objet. It places an obstacle between the subject and das Ding, which is the void inside the material. And this objet, this material, constitutes this void as a void. Without the materiality of the vase, there's no absence within. Without the objet doing its work, there's no emptiness of das Ding. So the obstacle that the objet erects around das Ding makes das Ding, constitutes das Ding. The nothingness of the thing emerges only through the obstacle of the objet, one could say. It's tempting to simply choose between them, to opt for das Ding or objet, and actually many people influenced by Lacan will do this. So if you know, Richard Boothby is sort of a das Ding guy, and Joan Kopchak's sort of an objet person. So there's a kind of way that things line up on each side. But my claim would be actually you kind of have to think of them both together at the same time. If we want to really understand how subjectivity works. Without das Ding, I think what's lost is the indication of the subject's inability to fit within this universe of generalized fetishism. The universe where the logic of the commodity reigns is that of capital society. And the thing not only allows us to make sense of how capitalism uses sublimation, but it also gives prominence to what refuses the commodity's reign. It's our senseless sacrifices made on behalf of the thing that we, in a way, testify to the insufficiency of the commodity. This is why Lacan turned to das Ding, and why I think we have to sustain it theoretically in the same way that Antigone does practically. So Antigone's insistence on burying her brother leads to her death. It's very clear. It occurs in defiance of the law. And Lacan rightly associates Antigone's burial of her brother with the act of sublimation, but unfortunately he doesn't leave it at that. According to Lacan's interpretation of Antigone, her desire in relation to her brother emerges in opposition to the law. In fact, desire, as Lacan conceives it in Seminar VII, is necessarily constituted in opposition to the structures of the law. The law's prohibition functions as the vehicle through which desire satisfies itself. Without the law, there's no path for desire and no possibility for enjoyment. He calls prohibition the all-terrain vehicle driving our enjoyment. So there's really a clear connection between transgression and enjoyment for him. And I think it's here that we can see the great misstep of Seminar VII, and why I think it's true that we have to understand the theoretical importance of the seminar, but also see the way in which it also represents a real misstep, even though I think there are people that think, no, enjoyment is always linked to transgression. And so they take this seminar as gospel. And I think that is a mistake. The seminar marks the first moment where Lacan identifies enjoyment as real. So prior to this, enjoyment is imaginary. And it's a real possibility for the subject, and it exists beyond symbolic and imaginary constraints. So it's no longer just the product of fantasy, but it resides in what the subject does. Okay, so far so good. But Lacan locates enjoyment in the act of transgressing the law, which I think creates pretty serious problems. The point of the law, as Lacan conceives it in this seminar, is to provide the subject with a limit in order to transgress to enjoy. So we need the law, otherwise we wouldn't have anything to transgress, otherwise as a result we wouldn't enjoy. The problem with this insistence on the role of the law is that it constitutes the possibility of enjoyment in a way that ignores what Lacan himself says earlier in the seminar about the role of sublimation. And I think he just can't have it both ways. Either sublimation raises an ordinary object to the dignity of the thing and thus facilitates our enjoyment, or the law creates dusting through its prohibition. I don't think there's any way to reconcile these two positions. And this alternative, to my mind, derails the seminar and ends up creating an impasse that causes Lacan to prematurely turn away from the fecundity of dusting. So I think he abandons dusting because he mistakenly links it to prohibition, which he will also, I think, abandon, rather than remaining true to his insight that it is the product of sublimation. So sublimation works because it ignores the symbolic context, not because it focuses on what the symbolic law interdicts. So sublimation doesn't care about interdiction. It doesn't care. This concept of enjoyment is necessarily linked to transgression not only contradicts Lacan's own statements on enjoyment in later years, but I think runs counter to the example of Antigone. So Antigone doesn't enjoy her defiance of Creon. It's clear instead that her defiance of Creon follows from her drive and the satisfaction that she derives from it. When Antigone talks with Creon, she expresses a total disregard for him and for his law. And I think this disregard, which results from her commitment to her thing, is the source of the splendor that so enraptures Lacan. Antigone doesn't defy the law for the sake of her desire, but on account of the value that she accords to Polynices. This is the key thing, I think. The defiance of Creon is actually incidental to her relationship with dusting. If we pay close attention to Antigone's trajectory during the play, to the extent that she even has one, her example has the effect of revealing or even correcting Lacan's own theoretical misstep on the question of the relationship between desire and enjoyment. What Lacan misses, I want to say, is just how little Antigone cares about Creon or his law. Lacan rightly draws attention to her insistence on the absolute singularity of her brother, but then I think he muddies up this insight by identifying her with the enjoyment of transgression. So Antigone finds enjoyment in devoting herself to her thing, to Polynices, and what's remarkable about her character, I think, is how little it changes from the beginning of the play to the end. She's just devoted to her thing, full stop. She vows to marry him at the beginning and honor his singularity regardless of what Creon commands, not just to defy Creon's command. It's clear she doesn't get off on, I'm defying him. She doesn't care. It's not a thing for her. Antigone ends in her position, not because she's in love with transgression or defiance, but because she's devoted to her sublime thing. She enjoys her thing while remaining more or less indifferent to the law. Lacan, I think, fails to see the independence of enjoyment from the law because he associates dusting with the mother. So I think he's still caught up in this seminar too much, I want to say, within the structure of Oedipus complex, where the father's interdiction plays the decisive role in establishing the mother's retroactive desirability. Right? So as Lacan conceives it here, the symbolic prohibition of the mother turns her into a desirable thing, into dusting. The law, in other words, creates dusting as a sight beyond symbolization. If dusting is the mother, it must be outside the symbolic structure, as prohibited. Later, I think, Lacan will recognize that the failure of symbolization doesn't involve an outside, but actually an internal failure. This coincides with the move from dusting to objet. The signifier stumbles over itself And this internal fissure is what Lacan will call the real. The notion of a real outside to the signifier, which he believes in the early seminar, that's his position in the early seminars, becomes a result of an imaginary misrecognition that captures Lacan himself in the early seminars up through Seminar VII. But this error makes him reluctant to talk about the thing at all, which results in the exile, I think, of one of his most important concepts and his most important philosophical insights. So Seminar VII marks simultaneously, I think, the high point of Lacan's theorizing and the low point at the same time. Nice dialectical position. His insight into the role that sublimation plays in constituting the drive, I think, represents a major innovation, maybe his most important. It enables us to conceive of Das Ding as the radical absence that acts as this gravitational force around us and around which the drive forms. But at the same time, the seminar advances a cockeyed conception of enjoyment located only in transgression. Lacan couldn't quite see that while the symbolic law is a necessary condition for the drive and the enjoyment that results from it, this enjoyment is in no way concerned with rebellion against a symbolic law. Or if it is, it's just incidentally. The seminar ends up by apotheosizing pointless acts of rebellion that do nothing but reinforce the symbolic structure that they revolt against. I think that's the most damaging part of the seminar. This gets to the heart, I think, of Slavoj Žižek's very thoughtful objection to the seminar as a whole. He claims, beneath this mask of flirting with radicality, it is basically this conservative vision. We have these moments of self-obliterating encounters with truth, but then we return to normal life, servicing the good, and so on. For all Lacan's celebration of Antigone's act of defiance, he envisions no staying power to it. So Antigone defies Creon, but then things just go back to the way they were. And I think this is why Žižek sees Lacan's vision here, Seminar VII, as a basically conservative one. So Lacan's hostility to the law in Seminar VII produces, one might say, a political dead end. And it's one that seduced many, many in its wake. But the other possibility birthed in this seminar, I think, should lead us to avoid committing the seminar to the flames too quickly. Because I think it is simultaneously, again, politically the most maybe misleading and the most fecund. So here, for the first and only time, Lacan provides a rigorous formulation of sublimation that completely departs from Freud's own conception and genuinely introduces something really radical and radically new. He identifies sublimation as the key to the structure of the drive and as the key to taking up an ethical position in the midst of enforced widespread commodification. So it's an ethics of psychoanalysis that's not just an ethics for how to act, for how the analyst should act, or for how to act in private activity, but instead it's a very much, I think, an anti-capitalist ethics, which maybe that's the only kind of ethics there is. The only path out of the logic of the commodity lies in holding fast to the emancipatory power of sublimation. Sublimation creates Das Ding. It is only by confronting the fundamental absence of Das Ding, in other words, including this absence in the conclusion of Seminar VII, that Lacan drops it, that we can free ourselves from the blandishments of the commodity. And I think that's the ethical imperative that's inherent in the seminar. Okay, thanks.